Did I mention how wonderful our staff is for setting all this up? We have wonderful, wonderful staff here at the Sperber Prize. So I'm just going to give everyone another moment to get situated. I see our participant numbers are going up. Okay, well, everyone, welcome to the 2021 awarding of the Sperber Book Prize here at Fordham University. I'm Beth Noble. I'm an associate professor of communication and media studies. I'm the director of the Sperber Prize. And on behalf of the university and the Department of Communication and Media Studies and the entire Sperber Prize family, I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. We'll be hearing from the two magnificent authors of the two winning books this year. We will have a giveaway of the books later on, so please stay tuned. I've had the honor of serving on this jury for the past 4 years. I've been the director of the prize just for a couple of months. And this is an award that goes to biographies of and memoirs by journalists and also biographies about journalists. And it's extremely important to Fordham and to our department to encourage people to write books about journalism and journalists who do so much to serve our public. So before we get to the winners and their books, it's my great pleasure to welcome Father Joseph M. McShane of the Society of Jesus, the president of Fordham University, for a few words of welcome. So Father McShane, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noble. And I have to say, it's an honor to be here. It's an event that I always look forward to. And since we didn't have it last year, I've been looking forward to this one with especially great longing. At the outset, I want to thank the Sperber family for being the sponsors, the creators and the sponsors of the prize. It has been for Fordham it's a real joy to work with you, because this has become one of the coveted prizes in the world of journalism and publishing and research. And therefore, we are grateful for your choice of us to be your partners in establishing the prize. And I want to thank Beth for really shepherding the process through these past pandemic months. It hasn't been easy. So Beth, thank you very, very much. Most of all this evening, I want to congratulate the two extraordinary winners of the two remarkable books that have been chosen as this year's books to be recognized with the Sperber Prize. First is Kerri Greenidge, who has written a book that is, I said in the period before we went live, a very topical book, a very timely book for us, and a book that raises as many questions as it answers. Questions like, why did it take so long for him to be rediscovered? How did you find him? What led you to him? What fascinated you about him? And are you pleased with the way in which the book has been received? And Lesley Blume, I said to her, I grew up with Hersey, and therefore I was surprised that he was back on the scene so many decades after the appearance of a book that was required reading for me when I was in high school and required reading for me when I was in college. And the same questions are raised. You really got beneath the surface. You addressed things with a fresh eye, and I think with a boldness, which makes this book stand out. But it also raises questions. Questions like the questions that I mentioned to Kerri just a few moments ago. What led you to this? What surprised you about the fact that nothing had been done in the kind of research, or with the kind of research that you used to really open this up in a new and, I think, most magnificent way? And what did you learn about American society, both authors? What did you learn about American society and culture as you did your research, as you wrote, and as the book came forth from the press and was received by the critics? So I'm looking forward to a lively and informative conversation, and I hand the conch back to Dr. Noble, because I could ask questions endlessly this evening, but this is not about me. It's about extraordinary writers who addressed very important topics and people. And so, Beth, back to you.
Thank you, Father. Again, thank you so much for being here. It's a really special night for us because this is the last Sperber Awards over which you will reign as president. For those of you who might not know, Father McShane will be stepping down at the end of the academic year. And so, Father, on behalf of the jury and the past directors of the prize, I would just really like to sincerely thank you for your support of the Sperber Prize and the vibrant journalism that lies at its core. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Alan Sperber. He's there with his wife, Betty. Dr. Sperber is a member of our jury. He's a urologist. He is the brother of Ann Sperber, for whom our award is named. So Alan, if you could please let our audience know a bit more about Ann and her work and how the Sperber Prize came to be, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Delighted. Thank you, Beth. Betty and I would also like to extend our welcome and thanks to all of you joining us tonight for the prize award ceremony via Zoom. Our wish is that we will be able to meet in person going forward in 2022. Our congratulations to this year's winners for their outstanding biographies, Lesley Blume for Fallout and Dr. Kerri Greenidge for Black Radical. Ann was born in Vienna, Austria, 1935, and came to New York City at the age of 4 to escape the monstrous Nazi regime. She attended the High School of Music and Art, the Juilliard School, and Barnard College, where she was a government major. She was always fascinated by the life and career of Edward R. Murrow and spent 13 years researching, interviewing, and writing the biography, Murrow, His Life and Times. Excuse me. When it was completed in 1986, Neil Hickey, writing in the Columbia Journalism Review, stated that no person need ever again write about Murrow. And he exclaimed, "What a man, what a life, what a book." It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 1987. Neil went on to write an introduction to the second edition of Murrow, which Fordham published in 1990. And Neil served on every jury until last year. He's with us via Zoom tonight and has our hope, our heartfelt gratitude for all that he's done for Ann's legacy through all these years. In 1988, Joseph Dembo left CBS, where he was director of network radio news, to become professor of media studies at Fordham. Among his courses was one on Edward R. Murrow, for which Murrow, His Life and Times was a textbook. So began the connection of Ann with Fordham. Ann tragically died suddenly in 1994 at the age of 58. In 1999, our mother, Lisa Lotta Sperber, in conjunction with Fordham, established the Ann M. Sperber Prize for the most outstanding biography or autobiography in the field of journalism for that year. The award has been given annually since then, except for 2 years when there was no book that merited being selected. The list of prominent winners and their books is too lengthy for my short talk, but represents an amazing tribute to Ann and Mom. I'd like at this time to pay tribute to 2 former jurors who passed away since the last award ceremony. The remarkable biographer, Patricia Bosworth, was a close friend of Ann, and Patricia served faithfully on the jury for many years. Sadly, she succumbed to COVID-19 in 2020. Father Raymond Schroth taught generations of journalists at Fordham. He himself was a biographer of one of Edward R. Murrow's boys, Eric Severide, and Ray served for many years on the jury and was a dear personal friend of mine as well. Finally, it is with true regret that we must note that Father Joseph McShane will be leaving Fordham presidency in June 2022. Throughout his presidency, Father McShane has been an enthusiastic supporter of the Sperber Prize and a close friend of the Sperber family. I'm reminded of the story when Thomas Jefferson became the second American ambassador to France in 1785. He was greeted by the French foreign minister who said, "I see that you are succeeding Benjamin Franklin as ambassador." Jefferson replied, "I am replacing Benjamin Franklin. No one can succeed him." So my best of luck to the next president of Fordham. Thank you, Father McShane, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you for those comments. Thank you for all that you do for our prize. I use the Monroe book in my class at Fordham, and it is magnificent, and it definitely has stood up the test of time. So before we move to the winners, I'd like to thank this year's jury for their hard work. Alan and I both serve on the jury, and there are 5 others I'd like to thank. One is Laura Oricchio, who is the Dean of Fordham College at Lincoln Center. I'm not exactly sure how she managed to find the time to be on our jury, but I'm thankful that she did. Meryl Gordon, professor at New York University, a storied biographer in her own right. Thank you, Meryl. We have 2 Pulitzer Prize winners. One is Joan Hedrick of Trinity College. The other is John Madison, a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Thank you both. And the newest member of our jury is Randall Pinkston, the former longtime correspondent and White House correspondent for CBS News, who is now teaching at Morgan State University as well. Thank you all for your time and your insight into the books. We actually considered about 25 books for the Sperber Prize this year. And they were a really wonderful bunch. There were autobiographies, there were memoirs, there were biographies. I particularly enjoyed a few written by 2 women I knew, one CNN's Clarissa Ward, another NPR's Maria Hinojosa, both delightful books. Another book we considered was written by one of our own, our department chair in communication and media studies at Fordham, Amy Aronson. Her book was on the founder of the ACLU, Crystal Eastman, who also did some time as a writer and a journalist and a founder of a publication. That is an astoundingly beautifully written and researched book. And so kudos to all of those whose books we considered this year. We had 3 finalists, in addition to the 2 books that you'll be hearing about. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about each of them. One was the book Citizen Reporters, S.S. McClure, Ida Tarbell, and the Magazine That Rewrote America by Stephanie Gorton. There's been a lot written about McClure's magazine, but this book was filled with interesting new information and really brought McClure and his star reporter Ida Tarbell to life. Another was called An Unladylike Profession, American Women War Correspondents in World War I by Chris Dubbs. And this book was a huge eye-opener that some of the most well-known reporters and authors actually spent time covering World War I, which is not exactly a time that we think of women out in the field covering journalism. The third book, which was a finalist, it was called The Journalist, Life and Loss in America's Secret War. It was written by a woman named Lucy Rose Fisher, based on the notes of her brother, Jerry Rose. Jerry Rose was a journalist who spent a lot of time in Vietnam in the early years before the Vietnam War. And he had a really storied career as a reporter. And unfortunately, he was killed in a plane crash. And so years later, his sister, Lucy Rose Fisher, found his notes and took them and wrote a memoir that is done in Jerry Rose's own voice. And so it's a very unusual memoir because it wasn't actually written by the person remembering, but it's a beautifully written book, and someone who teaches about the coverage of the Vietnam War, I found it very, very useful as well as very engaging. Those are all wonderful books. Congratulations to our finalists and to all of those whose books we considered this year. So now let's turn to our winning books. First, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kerri Greenidge, who's a Mellon Assistant Professor at Tufts University in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. She received her doctorate in American Studies from Boston University, where her specialty involved studying African American history, political science, and African American and African diasporic literature in post-emancipation and the early modern era. Her research explores the role of African American literature in the creation of radical Black political consciousness, particularly as it relates to local elections and democratic populism during the progressive era. So again, this is a very timely book, not only because what it says about those who fought to dismantle systemic racism. It's coming on a day where we've seen a historic election in Boston. Kerri, I wish that you had been able to be there during the jury's deliberation to hear all the warm words that were said about this book. The jurors were just, how could we have not known all the things in this book? They're so important. This is William Monroe Trotter is such an important historical figure. How could none of us have known about his life and his influence? So let me just briefly mention what some of the reviews said about Black Radical. Kirkus Reviews called it impressively researched and an absorbing biography that offers a fresh perspective on African American history. So Kerri, we're delighted to hear from you. Please take the floor and tell us all about Black Radical.
Well, thank you so much. And before I get started, I just wanted to say thank you to the Sperber Prize Committee and for everyone at Fordham University who have honored Black Radical and had those kind words to say. I am particularly thankful to Beth Noble. I know that running a prize awards ceremony during COVID times is difficult. So thank you for your work and your consideration. And also to my fellow winner, Lesley Blume, whose book I actually purchased for a friend of mine and for many family members. John Hersey was somebody who I was told to read when I was like in junior high and early high school. So it's wonderful to see. And finally, as Black Radical continues to resonate with readers, I want to thank my wonderful agent, Faith Childs. I don't thank her enough. There are many people who passed on the book, claiming that this was a figure that nobody would read about. And so I thank her for encouraging me. I'm going to just talk a little bit about an incident in Trotter's life that I think encapsulates why he is so fascinating to people and was to me, and then go into a little bit of what inspired me to write the book that is pretty personal of how I got into him. And so I'll just begin with a brief story. In 1919, so this is the end of World War I, an organizer named Henrietta Vinton Davis was greeting a group of African descended people in Kingston, Jamaica. She was greeting them on behalf of the United Negro Improvement Association, the organization of Marcus Garvey. And as she spoke to them, Henrietta Vinton Davis invoked the name of William Monroe Trotter. And she held up a copy of the Guardian newspaper from Boston to galvanize the crowd. She also pointed out to the crowd that the ship that was sitting in their harbor that date was a ship that was one that took Trotter to Paris when he attempted to present what he called the complaints of the colored world before the world. To galvanize the crowd further, Davis linked the UNIA's demands for Pan-Africanism and self-determination to Frederick Douglass, the most famous ex-slave of the previous century, and to William Monroe Trotter, a Phi Beta Kappa Harvard graduate who recently presented his demands for an end to global racism in Paris. As Davis told the crowd, the SS Frederick Douglass was actually the SS Yarmouth, the very ship that Trotter took. And as she said this, the crowd erupted into a chorus of cheers. The Boston editor's radicalism was so respected, Davis told the UNIA in her report of the incident, that stock purchases surged across Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad at the mere implication that Trotter was somehow involved. Davis and Garvey, of course, were not the only people of their time who were radicals to invoke William Monroe Trotter and the Guardian in their populist calls for Black radicalism. 2 years later, in 1921, Black men in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, referenced Trotter, the Guardian, and Black Boston in their armed defense against white violence. From May 31st to June 1st, 1921, whites in Tulsa burned Greenwood to the ground, forcing over 10,000 Black men, women, and children to flee their homes. Known as the Negro Wall Street, Greenwood was the wealthiest all-Black city in America, where Black migrants built their own investment firms, hospitals, newspapers, and small businesses. By the time of the Tulsa massacre, Blacks in Greenwood survived the economic recession that roiled post-war northeastern Oklahoma, more financially stable than many predominantly white towns in the area. By the end of the massacre, however, the infamous Tulsa massacre, Greenwood was completely destroyed by what turned out to be a coordinated attack by government officials, Tulsa's white business leaders, and the state militia. As their families fled and their neighborhood collapsed, members of the Tulsa branch of what was called the African Blood Brotherhood shot back at white mobs and police cars. When white pundits in the New York Times and the Washington Star accused the Brotherhood of, quote, wanton attacks on the white race, end quote, an ABB member retorted, quote, certainly the Negro heroes who fought to the death at Tulsa in defense of Negro honor and manhood and the helpless women and children behind the lines have gained Valhalla and have been recognized fit inmates of whatever paradise exists on the other side. We owe a debt of gratitude to Trotter of Boston for showing us the way. As to the accusation that the Tulsa Post of the African Blood Brotherhood fomented and directed the riot, he concluded, the first part is a lie, and whether we directed the Negroes in their fight for self-defense is certainly no crime in Negro eyes and is left for the white Oklahoma authorities. For ourselves, we neither deny it nor affirm it. All hail Trotter and the courageousness of colored newspaper men everywhere. Although the ABB could not save Greenwood, it inspired Black radical political consciousness across the African diaspora in its call to, quote, use armed self-defense to protect ourselves and our families in the names of heroes of old, Toussaint Louverture, Hannibal, and Placido. Founded in 1919 by Trotter and his fellow radicals in Harlem, the African Blood Brotherhood used the violence of Red Summer, the failure of the Great War to address anti-colonial impulse of the darker world, and the racialized rhetoric of self-determination. He used all of these to fight for the lives of what he called the colored people. Self-determination, Trotter often said, is the only way. Agitate, agitate, agitate. So who was William Monroe Trotter? Why was he alone among contemporaries in protesting unapologetically, persistently, and radically against racial conservatism and white liberal apathy in the face of radical Reconstruction's betrayal at the turn of the last century? Most importantly, how does his use of the Guardian to foment grassroots radical Black politics demand a scholarly reconceptualization and a popular rethinking of the Black press, Black political independence, and the possibilities of community activism during the period that historians referred to as, quote, the long nadir at the turn of the last century? William Monroe Trotter was born in 1872, the year that liberal Republicans broke from their radical colleagues to oppose federal enforcement of Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. He died exactly 62 years later as Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt presided over an administration that fundamentally changed the relationship between federal policy and the American economy. Bookended as he was between the failed promise of radical Reconstruction and the racial limitations of New Deal liberalism, William Monroe Trotter's life represents the radical possibilities of Black politics that are rooted in transnational Black radicalism. Trotter's life also reconceptualizes Black radicalism as a tradition that thrived and existed outside of the rural South, in the urban, predominantly white Northeast, amongst an ethnically and culturally diverse Black community in places like Boston, as well as places like Mississippi. Trotter was a newspaper man through and through. He used the Guardian to galvanize Black radicalism, and he did that because he was rooted in the idea that Blackness itself was diasporic in nature, that Black people and all oppressed people had the right to define and determine the way that they would be ruled and how they would respond to being ruled. I first heard about William Monroe Trotter from my grandfather, Samuel Lee Dance, a proud Black veteran of World War II, African-American man who was raised in Petersburg, Virginia, and who was intensely political, even though he never graduated from high school. He and my grandmother were activists in the mold of Howard Thurman, whose Jesus and the Disinherited sit on our bookshelf, beside a copy of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. My grandparents were amongst the first African Americans to purchase a house in a suburb called Arlington, Massachusetts during the 1950s, although they spent their lives involved in civil rights work across Greater Boston, New England, and New York. It was from them that I learned to look for Black stories beyond the existing scholarship, in supposedly predominantly white places like New England and Boston, as well as distinctly African places like the Mississippi Delta and Haiti. Often my grandfather would pile me, my sisters, my cousins, and any neighborhood kid who happened to be around into his silver Cadillac, who would drive up and down Route 2, west on I-90 in Massachusetts, or south towards the Cape, and he would point out places that seemed insignificant. Downtown New Bedford, the fishing shacks of Plum Island, or the woods around Great Barrington and Mount Greylock in the Berkshires. And as he pointed to them, he would say that Black people and Native people set their footprints there. He was the first to tell us about slavery in Medford, Cape Verdean labor organizers in Dartmouth, and Black sleeping car porters in the South End of Boston. And he was the first to tell me about Trotter. I was homesick and I was lying on the couch in his living room while he cleaned up from lunch and watched a midday local news program. I was 7 years old, and the program was a retrospective on the 10th anniversary of anti-busing riots in South Boston. And the TV had all these images of white people throwing bricks and hurling the N-word at Black children in Roxbury, some of whom my grandparents personally knew. And I remember my grandfather saying out loud to nobody in particular, none of that would have happened if Trotter were here. When my grandmother came home, I asked her who Trotter was, and she took me in her lap and wrote his name on a piece of paper. She and my grandfather told me that Trotter was a race man like Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X. And my grandmother showed me a copy of Stephen R. Fox's 1970 biography, The Guardian of Boston. When I grew up, I found that book in a used bookstore, bought it for $5, and read it cover to cover in 1 weekend, convinced, like my grandparents, that Black stories are always far more complex than we believe, and that stories like Trotter's ought to be as analyzed, discussed, and studied as Du Bois, Garvey, King, and Malcolm X. It has been my hope with Black Radical to reorient the scholarship toward these stories, not as a form of hagiography or racial exceptionalism, but as a way to challenge ourselves to more completely reckon with our complicated and often painful racial history. On the importance of biography and community stories, I'll end with a quote by the scholar Nell Irvin Painter, who says, "Beyond even the most finely tuned categories lies something exceeding race, class, and gender, individual subjectivity. I remain," Painter says, "convinced that historians should keep in sight the fundamental lessons of psychology and psychoanalysis. They should understand that families need not be related biologically, that people come from families, that attachment does not necessarily connote positive feeling, that attachment and grief do not stop at social barriers of color or class. Families," she concludes, "at every economic level, and communities, I would argue, inculcate the finest and basis of American values and values that can be valued throughout the world." So thank you very much for honoring Black Radical, and thank you so much to my fellow nominees and my fellow winner.
Kerri, thank you so much. I feel that I made a mistake. I should have held up the book. There we go. It's always so hard to do this on Zoom. There it is. There's a beautiful cover. It's really an astounding read. I can't even tell you how many times I was reading it and I put the book down, or I would reread sentences over and over and just go, how did she do that? Or how did she find that? Or how long did it take her to write this? So we're going to come back to you with some questions about how you did the research for this book. So thank you so much for that. Fascinating. I have to say, if your goal was to help reorient the world, to help people deal with the country's painful but important history, you've totally succeeded. So let's hear from our other winning author here. And let me hold up the book. There we go. This is the paperback. I have a hardback too. You can see the Times Notable Book sticker. Lesley Blume, welcome, and please tell us about Fallout and John Hersey.
Thank you so much. First of all, Beth, Dr. Noble, thank you. And thank you to the Sperber family. and to Father McShane, to the Sperber jury for honoring Fallout, and by extension for honoring the important work of my book's protagonist, John Hersey, whose work and whose basic decency inspired me so much as a journalist and a historian during this extremely difficult and tumultuous past 5 years. Kerri, thank you for thanking your agent, because it reminded me to thank mine. I'd like to thank my agent, Molly Friedrich, and my other literary agent, Lucy Carson, and my editor at Simon & Schuster, Eamon Dolan, because all three were intimately involved from conceiving this book from the very earliest stages. So this honor belongs to them as much as it belongs to me. I'm very flattered to have been included among the prestigious past recipients of this reward, many of whom I have long admired, and some of whom actually helped me while I was researching my own book. And I mean, Robert Caro, Seymour Hersh, Charles Blow, Douglas Brinkley, Arthur Gelb. I mean, this is some pretty heady company to keep. And my journalist dad is, someplace in heaven or the other place, being pretty proud of his daughter right now. And I am so honored also to share this award with you, Kerri, with Dr. Greenidge. And I thank you for your extremely important research and your work into the life of William Monroe Trotter. And I really look forward to grilling you more about your process and your research also, and learning more, because for me, the book was just the tip of the iceberg. And congratulations to you. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis of Fallout. 6 years ago in 2015, I was looking for my next nonfiction book subject. And my search coincided with the rise of Donald Trump as the GOP presidential candidate. And suddenly and shockingly, America's best journalists were dubbed enemies of the people by Trump and his followers. And journalists began to be threatened at his rallies. And some of them were donning T-shirts that said things that like, journalist, tree, rope, some assembly required. Now, I come from a news family. My dad was a writer and a speechwriter for Walter Cronkite, who at one point was dubbed the most trusted man in America. I met my husband, who was a journalist turned First Amendment attorney in the Nightline newsroom 20 years ago. And I've been working in newsrooms for 20 years in newsrooms across the nation and around the world, basically since I was a teenager. So my entire world, my entire life, without exaggeration, has been centered on newsrooms, and my extended community of reporter colleagues is like family. And then suddenly in the Trump era, my family was on a hit list. So against that backdrop, I knew that I wanted and needed to write a book depicting a story about the deadly importance of our journalists and investigative journalism and our free press. And in my research, I came across John Hersey's breakthrough revelations, and it sort of hints at the backstory of his 1946 New Yorker article, Hiroshima, which documented the true aftermath of the US's then experimental mega weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that reporting revealed to a global audience the true implications of the just born atomic age. And so here was an extremely powerful example of a journalist holding the powerful to account at great risk to himself. And also, astonishingly, and luckily for me, no one had yet fully explored the backstory of how Hersey got the story that nobody else could get. No other journalist had gotten it and broken it in the way that he did. And it seemed like it was kind of like green lighting from the biography gods. So I went for it. So Fallout ended up coming out just ahead of the 2020 election, when the stakes for our press and for our democracy could not have been higher. There likely would have been interest in the subject anyway, because last August marked the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, and there's always commemorative coverage. But Fallout also seemed to hit the nerve that I hoped it would, with both the press and readers alike, seeing the valiance and the relevance of Hersey's intrepid, on-the-ground, shoe-leather journalism, his investigative report. Because we knew in the Trump era that countless egregious events desperately needed to be investigated also, and that the role of journalists had likely never been more crucial in recent history. This continues to be the case in the post-Trump era, or the post-first administration of Trump era, as journalists continue the essential work of looking back and parsing events of the past half decade. Extremely important work is already being done on, for instance, on the January 6th insurrection, a horrific event that will be probed by historians like Kerri and me for decades. But the journalism being done today will provide an essential basis for future generations examining and trying to understand what really went down on that day. And something that we have painfully learned time and again is that our government does not always act in our best interest, to say the least. In Hersey's era, the US government had just won at great cost a military victory over the Axis powers. And as these enemies had irrefutably perpetrated widespread war crimes, the US seemed to be on the moral high ground in its victory. So therefore, for the US government, the stakes in covering up the true aftermath, the true radioactive aftermath in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were high, lest the US be seen in its hour of triumph as, quote, having outdone Hitler in atrocities, end quote, as the American Secretary of War put it at the time. Yet Hersey, along with a handful of other forerunning journalists who tried to get the word out about Hiroshima, he refused to toe that line. He would not be suppressed. As far as he and some of his colleagues were concerned, the US had just fought the war in part to help preserve the freedom of the press. And to them, and frankly, even to some of the US generals who had led wartime troops, the Fourth Estate and the freedom to report was a crucial pillar of the democratic ideal. As I say in my book, quote, Hersey was not going to be muzzled, and nor were he and his colleagues willing to allow those in power to denigrate the freedoms that had just been so painfully defended. So today we continue to battle those who would degrade our democracy through attacks on its processes and through distortion of its ideals, and our press remains under assault. It staggers under the weight of combating disinformation. When I talk with journalism students in programs across the country, I tell them that they are poised to become the most crucial, yet the most challenged generation of journalists in this country's history. I hope that fallout and Hersey will inspire them to stand up in face of today's significant challenges as they continue to hold the powerful to account. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lesley. I neglected to read Lesley's biography. She's a Los Angeles-based journalist, author, biographer. Her work has appeared in Vanity Fair, in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Paris Review, among many other publications. And her last nonfiction book, Everybody Behaves Badly, was a New York Times bestseller. I have to say, I can definitely foresee using this book in my journalism classes. It's so incredibly important that young journalists like the ones I teach at Fordham be reminded that that this is what journalism is really all about. I have no problem with, I love sports journalism and I love reading, gossip as much as the next person, but holding the government accountable for its actions that's actually what I study, and it's why we need journalism. I have to note that the Washington Post, in its review of your book, said that it's timely on its own. However, as the idea that a democracy's highest officials might use verbal sleight of hand to distract citizens from a crisis has been cropping up of late, that it was even more important than ever. I'll also note that the acknowledgements alone to the book run about 7 pages. So I definitely like to hear more about the research. But before we go on to having the chance for our audience to ask questions, I'd like to offer the chance to Father McShane to start us off with any questions he might have for the authors.
Right. Thank you very much, Beth. The books both stand by themselves. But what both of you just said really raised more questions about the whole process of writing and the importance of the work that you have both done. I'm going to begin with a question, if I might, to Kerri. Kerri, I consider myself a fairly informed guy and try to consume as much as I can of news and that which is newsworthy. However, this is painful for me to admit. I knew absolutely nothing about Tulsa and Black Wall Street until about, I want to say about 11 months ago. This leads me to say with shame that a whole part of the American story, it's not just the Black story, but a whole part of the American story has been invisible to me. how can this be? And I suspect I'm not alone in making that terrible admission that I did not know about this really horrendous event in American history. Why? How can that be? How could this be so invisible for so long? It's a century ago. And it's only in the last 11 months that it has had any coverage. And toward the end of your book, you'll get into it. So can you give me some help on this? And I say, I'm a fairly informed guy. And this was, a case of invisibility.
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for that. I think that, and this gets to the reason why we're all here in terms of journalism, I think having a press that speaks to and holds power accountable, if that doesn't exist in periods in history, then often stories aren't recorded as they happen, right? And so one of the things with Tulsa throughout the book, I point out all of these incidents that Trotter was warning about and responding to and protesting against and organizing against. One of his goals as a journalist was to, as he called it, hold a mirror up to nature, and that's a Shakespeare quote, basically arguing that that was the job of the press, that the press's job was not to boost kind of patriotism or blind allegiance or uncomplicated allegiance to somebody or something. It really was to question and hold a mirror up to what was actually happening. And so when you ask about something like Tulsa, I think Tulsa is one of many incidents that occurred in the early 20th century and that people were being erased as they were happening, right? Because as Leslie Blume just alluded to, right? If you don't have a press that's holding a mirror up to power and questioning it, then the very things as they're happening, the way they're written about is either they're not written about or they're made to seem as if they aren't as bad as they were at the time. And so if anything, one of the things I really appreciated and admired the more I dug into someone like Trotter was that he was kind of like Lear screaming into the heath kind of thing, basically saying, nobody is covering this stuff, right? And because nobody is covering it, that's why this stuff keeps happening, right? And so he was very instrumental in arguing that the press should be used and should always be seen as a way to critique and question power, even people in power that he was supposed to be in allegiance to, right? That he was supposed to have some type of affinity for, right? And so something like Tulsa can be forgotten if it's not recorded and questioned as it's happening on the ground. And I think it speaks to, the ways in which history, if it is not recorded as it's happening and documented, within a year or so, people were talking about the Tulsa thing as if it was just a skirmish, right? When you look at sort of newspaper coverage by 1922, people were talking as if this hadn't happened. And so really Trotter would say and would argue that that's the importance of journalism, right? And the importance of newspapers and the importance of making sure that newspapers are reflecting and inspiring actual people on the ground. As complicated and as infuriating and as time consuming as that might be. And Trotter was very critical, of communities themselves, although that was where his sort of lifeblood was. But you have to record and enter the story through those communities.
Thank you very much. To me, it's a shocking sort of revelation that you just described. You contextualized, the coverage, if I can say, or the non-coverage. And because there was not enough coverage at the time, it disappeared from the American memory and psyche. And so a century later, finally, it is brought back for us to look at, to study, and to learn from. So that's another one of the great virtues of your book. You help us to see the importance and power of journalism, absolutely, but also the harm of national amnesia. And that's, I think, what you've been referred to. There's a national amnesia concerning what has been a shameful part of our shared history. And when I speak to our students here, I say, This is our shared history. Now, without meaning to be blustery or anything, I always say, Black history is American history. And we have to say that over and over again. It's not an alternative history. It is part of who we are. So I want to thank you for contextualizing it in the answer you just gave, but also in the book. Frederick Douglass, I dove back into Frederick Douglass when I was looking at his interactions with Lincoln. One of the things I found most extraordinary is that Lincoln considered him a friend and he considered Lincoln a friend, but not an uncritical friend. And after the second inaugural, he sought out Douglass to get Douglass's response. Now, why didn't I know that already? Because there was an invisibility and an amnesia here and willful ignorance. And that's the part that's really, I would say, disturbing to me is willful ignorance. So thank you. I'm going to turn now, if I could, to Lesley. I have a question for you, and I'm going to contextualize the question. As I mentioned to you, I had read Hersey's book as a high school student back in the last millennium, and as a college student, also in the last millennium. Okay. And so, that was part of my understanding of the post-war American, reflection. But he was a different kind of person. But still, when I was in grad school at the University of Chicago, my first summer there, I didn't come home to New York. I stayed there because I wanted to do some more research in the library. And I remember this as if it were yesterday. On the 6th of August, I was out for a walk around noon on the campus. And tour bus after tour bus after tour bus pulled up at Henry Moore's haunting sculpture called Nuclear Energy. It was right outside the library. The library was built on the site of Stagg Field, which was the football stadium for the University of Chicago, which didn't have a football program after they left the Big Ten. But under the stands, that's where the Manhattan Project took place. That's where all the research was done. So I was outside the library where I was, and these buses pulled up, and out of the buses poured tens, hundreds of Japanese tourists who walked over to this sculpture, nuclear power, nuclear energy, in silence, complete silence, bowed their heads. They did not bow toward it, they bowed their heads, stayed there for what I thought was a very long time, and then in complete silence, went back on the buses, and the buses disappeared. The next year, I made sure I was out there on August the 6th. The same thing happened. And these were not, Lesley, these were not big anniversary years. And so reading what you have written and remembering the Hersey book, again, we did not spend enough time contemplating the enormity of what had happened, the enormity of what we had done. And it was the experience I had of watching Japanese tourists come to observe this moment each year that led me to say, there's more, and we didn't get everything. So I want to ask you, in your research, were you both fascinated and frustrated by the post-Hersey amnesia? It did not remain a subject of great deal of debate. It was accepted, we said it was necessary, and we accepted that and moved on. Were you frustrated and fascinated by that? Because it's my experience with the Japanese tourists led me to say, there's something bigger here. That's a long question. That's not really a question. It's an observation followed by a plea for help in understanding.
Well, I don't know if I can provide help, but I can riff on it. There's one anecdote in my book where Hersey's Hiroshima has come out a year after the bombing, and really there had been no major in-depth account of what it had been like to be a human being on the receiving end of the Hiroshima bomb up until that point. And it stopped America in its tracks. Everybody was reading it. Even if you weren't reading it, you were listening about it on the radio. It was covered on 500 radio stations. You were reading front page editorial reviews and profiles of Hersey on it. You were fully aware of it. But one of the New Yorker editors, the story appeared in the New Yorker, was in Grand Central kind of casing the joint to see how much, how many copies had sold out. And he said that he saw a group of Japanese American soldiers who had fought, on behalf of the American side, who went up and got, some of the last copies of the New Yorker with the article in it, and were sitting in a row in the middle of all of the hubbub of Grand Central. America totally back to normal, people rushing to work, people rushing home, people running to lunches, and this group of Japanese American soldiers were reading in silence, with total solemnity, Hersey's account of what had happened to the nearly entirely civilian population of Hiroshima on August 6th, the year earlier. Look, the difference between there was before Hersey and there was after Hersey, because really up to Hersey's, the release of Hersey's report, not very much was known at all in any detail about the nuclear weapons and what it had been like, what it had been like to experience nuclear attack, but also what the long-term effects of those attacks were. And it was the feeling amongst most Americans towards the bomb was one of total joy. Not only it was tied up in feelings of extreme vengeance. They got what they deserved because of Pearl Harbor. Harry Truman, in his own announcement about the bomb to the American public, said that Japan had been, quote, repaid manyfold. One of the readers who read Hersey's account described what he called the 4th of July attitude towards the bomb between the actual bombing and Hersey's report. But after Hersey's report came out, there actually was, a complete solemnity attached to the event, and no longer, were there, atomic bomb jokes that could be considered in good taste or even passable taste. And you were speaking of willful ignorance. After Hersey's report came out, the only way that you could be oblivious to what nuclear warfare portended for humanity and what the Americans had done to win the war was through willful ignorance. And because Hersey's work was so widely read, there really never was the kind of amnesia that we're talking about in Kerri's subject, for instance, where there's just erasure. Hersey's book was really, really widely read, and it inspired, generations of really powerful leaders and activists to help combat, to continue to affect public attitudes towards nuclear weapons. And also, they're part of the reason why we haven't seen a wartime use of a nuclear weapon since World War II is because of what, many experts and journalists and everybody call the nuclear taboo. Hersey contributed to the nuclear taboo. Before he reported on the bomb, it was just another big piece of the arsenal. They could have used it at any time. But after his reporting came out, there was a visceral repulsion. You could not lightly use nuclear weapons, around the world on civilian or military populations. So I don't see it as being amnesiac in the same way. I will say that it has become, in brief, that it has become increasingly difficult to place stories now about the nuclear landscape, even though we do have Hersey's reporting, and even though the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for 2 years in a row have deemed this to be the most threatening nuclear environment in history. And you still, for love or money, cannot get stories placed on nuclear threat in many major news publications or outlets.
Thank you very much. And you're quite right. There's a difference between the willful ignorance and amnesia that Kerri was reporting on and your own. But it just, I guess the American people have seen it. We have seen, with the possibility of Iran getting a nuclear capability, there is that, I guess, reaction that you're referring to, which is thank you for the correction and the corrective action that you took with me, and that's important. And I'm reminded of, now you're all too young, you were not alive when this happened, but when Pope Paul VI visited the United Nations in 1965, I think it was, October the 4th, he said in the General Assembly, in French, jamais plus la guerre, no more war, war never again. And he went right after nukes. And he felt he had to reinforce that. So thank you. Beth, I could go on and on with these extraordinary writers because I'm so fascinated by their work, and so I learned so much from their answers. But it's not me. I hand it back to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Father. So what I'd actually like to do is to invite the audience to put in the chat any questions that you might have for our winning authors, and we'll give people a chance to do that. And in the meantime, I just want to see if Dr. Sperber, you might have a question for our winning authors.
No, there's been so much covered here. I'm fascinated by the perspectives of how the authors went about to doing their work. I know Anne dug into things so deeply, and I see this happening now with this generation too. And it's just remarkable. I really congratulate both authors for wonderful, wonderful research.
Yeah, well, I'd like to actually ask a little bit more. First, we'll start with Lesley and then Kerri. I mean, the research for both of these books is just absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I assume we're talking years of research. Maybe Lesley, you can come in. Like, how long did it take to do the research? How many different countries were involved? How did you do research in countries where you might not speak the language, like Japan?
Well, I don't want to undercut your faith in my research, because it actually had to be done really quickly, because it was conceived in 2015 with a pub date of 2020. And as you guys know, the book has to be done a year ahead of time. So I was really in book world, that's a hideous deadline, especially for something with that level of research. I was incredibly lucky. I was able to assemble a research team, because as you state, this book had to be researched on 3 continents in 4 languages. So it was, English, Japanese, German, and Russian. And I'm also really proud to say that the vast majority, 9 out of my 10 researchers were women, and they crushed it. And so it was really intense. This was a major archival dig. The interview, we were just a little bit too late for this book to do interviews with a lot of Hersey's contemporaries, but we did get a few, but the vast majority of it was archival research. And in my nerdy world, it was incredibly thrilling. We would find, these misfiled documents, and they would break open a whole new aspect of the narrative. There was a whole Russian aspect to the narrative that I hadn't realized was going to be a part of the book when I went into it. And it was something that came to me through, again, a misfiled document in somebody's personal archive. So it was really intense, but I have to be honest, it was such fascinating work. It was the love of my professional life. It was also, because it was such righteous research in the right moment, it was like, couldn't have been more galvanizing. So I basically didn't sleep from 2015 to 2020, which is why I look like this now. But it was completely thrilling, and I still have. I just want to mention one of my researchers in particular. My right-hand woman was a Russian translator, Anastasia Osipova. I swear to God, Putin would be terrified of her. There was nothing that she couldn't help me find. Nobody she couldn't help me track down. No document that was too elusive. And she actually remains a writing partner for me now.
Well, that's wonderful. As someone who spent a good chunk of her career in Russia, I know exactly what you mean about the ferociousness of some of the Russian journalists and Russian researchers.
Well, you have to be. For survival. Good luck getting what you need out of some of those archives, but she did it. So
yeah, that's an achievement. Let me tell you, as someone who spent time trying to do that. Kerri, let me ask you to jump in here too. How many years of work was this? How did you do this?
Well, and I definitely sympathize with being a nerdy person. So I kind of one of those people who collect things. So from the time I was an undergraduate, I didn't know what the book was, but I would go into different archives and gather stuff over the years. And Trotter was a chapter in my dissertation, but amazingly, I was told by many people that I couldn't study Trotter because there's no information about him, and that you know, he didn't have a fascinating enough life to become a whole book. And so while I was doing my graduate work, I really was keeping kind of a Trotter file of stuff, just every time I kept on coming across his name in things. And then I really made it a point to go and read every issue of The Guardian, which is scattered throughout archives in Boston and at Fisk University. And then in other people's, like you were saying, Lesley, in other people's archives, there will be like, you know, 3 years worth of The Guardian, but they're not in an archive. So it was really a matter of just making my way through those. And then I really wanted it to be a book about a city and a group of people, and really describe what that might look like. And so I did a lot of research on newspapers, personal narratives of people, a lot of archival research into family histories, because I really wanted to get into the world that Trotter was in at the time. So a lot of family history work, and then really looking at, to do a lot of the political stuff, looking at what people were saying about elections at the time, not what historians look back and say about elections. So it was really a matter of going in and trying not to pay attention to a lot of secondary sources. So what other historians have said about this moment, you know, so because if I had paid attention to that, it would have been, you know, well, Black people in the North had no effect on politics in 1890s. Right, that's kind of the narrative. But if you go in and look at what actual pundits of that time period were saying, they did have a big effect, and Trotter's name again kept popping up in places. And so it was really a lot of going into papers of people that didn't at first seem like they were associated with Trotter. Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator, you know, a lot of random older Protestant people in Boston that have all these files on themselves, and like the Mass Historical Society, going in there, and you know, you'd find these little things about Trotter and the Black community in there. So if there's one thing I will say, it's again looking for stories outside of what might even seem comfortable as like a trained scholar, right? And really looking at sources that people might not necessarily think of as a source, right? Why would Trotter be in the papers of Henry Cabot Lodge, for instance? Well, he is, because they talked to each other and debated. And so it was a lot of years of that type of stuff. And then really being determined that as much as what I wanted the book to look like, which was really looking at his life and doing it from the perspective of the newspapers, because he wrote newspapers, and he did his newspapers up until he died, really the week before he died in 1934. He was constantly writing and sketching and commenting in a very sophisticated way on politics, but all of that is in sort of these scattered archives throughout the country. So it was a big undertaking, but again, it was one of those things that I really was fascinated by, how somebody can be so present kind of in the primary source material, even though historians don't recognize that person's there. And it's just kind of, that was more fascinating to me than oftentimes even his fascinating life.
It is an incredibly fascinating life, and I think we could talk about it forever. Father McShane, did you have something to add?
Yes, I wanted to follow up on something Kerri said. Kerri, I may be misconstruing what you said, but what you said led me to believe there's no archive that has all of the Guardian in one place. Are you telling me that?
Yes, that's true.
In the Boston Public Library or any of those other, you know, massive collections, there's no central archive. There's no library that has the archive of all of the issues of the Guardian. That's astounding to me. I can't understand. I can't believe it.
Yeah. And
I, by the way, if you don't mind, I'd like to identify myself as a card-carrying nerd like the two of you. Nothing is better to me than spending the day in archives and getting my fingers dirty with all the dust and so on. But this is a shocking statement on your part. And I'm just wondering, again, I'm going to go back to the invisibility of the Black community. Invisible over time, even to itself.
Mhm.
That is to me a really, it's a stunning
Yes.
thing to reflect upon. So I was just stunned at the thought that there's no archive that brings all of these materials together. And that's almost sinful, frankly.
It is quite unbelievable. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. I mean, I have about 100 more questions just about Trotter and his life and his psychology, but we are almost out of time. So what I'd like to do is to ask Father McShane to actually confer the awards upon you. Each of you will be receiving a check, if you haven't already, for $500. It's usually $1,000 prize, but we've had to split it. But we know you will put the money to good use. So we will get this framed and off to you. We have a certificate for each of you. So let's start with Kerri. You can sort of see this here.
Kerri,
Thank you so much.
Kerri, I said that Beth said that I would confer this. I have to say, this has got to be seen as a joint or shared honor to do this. So I'm going to ask the Sperbers and you, Beth, as really the person who has directed the program, to join me in saying to first Kerri, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's an honor, and thank you so much.
In honoring, we associate.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Honor for congratulations and
Congratulations from the Sperbers. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the honor. It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
we hope that this framed version of the proclamation will find a place in your office.
Yes.
You're at BU still, right?
At Tufts.
Okay.
So I'm teaching at Tufts. I have a new office. I will put it up there. So thank you so much.
So you're spending your life among the jumbos.
Yes, yes,
The Tufts students are called jumbos.
yes, yes.
Oh my. So
And then we've got one more. This
Right.
is the one for Lesley.
Leslie,
Oh, no, that's the wrong one. That's Harry's. This is the one for Lesley.
all right. I will start off by saying, on behalf of Fordham University, it is my great honor to name you one of the Sperber Prize winners for this year, a historic year, the first time in our history, number one, that we had 2 women authors honored, and number 2, the first time we've had 2 authors honored. So in honoring you, we honor ourselves because we associate ourselves with the excellence of your book.
Thank
Now I
you.
turn to Dr. Sperber and Betsy.
Yes, congratulations. I cannot add to what Father McShane has said. 2 wonderful authors. First time that we've had 2 winners. First time we've had 2 women authors. We've had 1 female author in the past. That was in 2005. And it's really wonderful time.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor.
And
Thank
Beth,
you so much, and wonderful book, Lesley. It's a great book. So thank you.
Likewise to you. Thank you so much. This was wonderful, and I'm thrilled. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
We're
Very
thrilled
welcome.
too. Thank you both so much. For those of you who are still with us, we've got 2 copies of Fallout and 1 copy of Black Radical. If you're interested in winning one, I invite you to send me an email at noble@fordham.edu, like my name there on your Zoom screen, KNOBEL, and we will do a drawing and send you a book. Thanks to Simon & Schuster and to W.W. Norton for providing those books and for publishing these wonderful works. So with that, let me thank you all for joining us. Father McShane, sincere thanks for being here today. Kerri and Lesley, congratulations. Alan, thank you. And Betty, thank you for entrusting Fordham to honor your sister. I'd like to say thanks to our staff in the Department of Communication and Media Studies, the incredible Michelle O'Dwyer, the wonderful Christopher Vicari, the delightful Claudia Rivera, who helped arrange today's webinar. I sincerely hope that this time next year we will be together again in person to celebrate great books about great journalism together. So God bless you all. Perhaps the best way to end tonight is as Monroe would have ended it. Good night and good luck. Congratulations again to our prize winners. Kerri, Lesley, thank you for writing these inspiring books. Thank you very much. Could not be more timely. And we're very proud to add you to the list of winners of the Sperber Book Prize.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for the work that you guys have been doing to honor journalists and journalism during this very important time.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
so
everyone.
much.